I'm on the campus of Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, with Owen Muelder. Owen is director of the Galesburg Colony Underground Railroad Freedom Center here at Knox. Owen, I'm just delighted that you could talk to us today. Thank you so much for taking the time.
I'm pleased to be here.
You have written an absolutely fascinating book called The Underground Railroad in Western Illinois. And your book describes in detail the activities of the Underground Railroad in this part of the state. But I was particularly intrigued to read about the role that railroads played, particularly the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, in helping fugitive slaves find their way to freedom. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. First, I want you to just tell me a little bit about your work here at the Underground Railroad Freedom Center. I imagine that researching the Underground Railroad is a little bit difficult. It occurred 150 years ago. It was secretive. It was illegal behavior. I suspect that there aren't a lot of records to consult.
Well, Julie, you're absolutely right. The Underground Railroad really, for scholars over the decades, has been a very difficult subject to research because it was secretive. I like to say that for the most part, it was conducted in the shadows. And consequently, it's very difficult to find records that verify stories that are passed down. So scholarship has to be precise in order to try to get to the truth, but ferreting out these records can sometimes be difficult.
And so do you consider that to be the mission of the Underground Railroad Freedom Center, to do this groundbreaking work?
The mission of the Underground Railroad Center at Knox is important for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is because the work of abolitionists and Underground Railroad operators before the Civil War represents the first socially integrated movement in American history. We hope at Knox College that the story of this college's early history is, of course, not lost. The people who come to Galesburg to establish the town and the college are the same people in the 1830s. The overwhelming majority of them came from upstate New York and were abolitionists before they arrived here. So I think it's important for people to know that this community was a Western anchor of the anti-slavery movement before the Civil War, and I hope that my scholarship contributes more broadly and nationally to fitting into that important story. If you look at it at the other end, we feel good about the fact that it's an opportunity to educate public school students locally and regionally about this story because it has such a rich history here. And finally, I'd say, I think it's important to Galesburg. Tourism has become something that's been very important to this community over the last few decades, and we know that a number of people come to our campus to learn more about Knox's ties to this anti-slavery story, and of course, to the story that Abraham Lincoln brings to Knox in various ways, but primarily at the Fifth Lincoln-Douglas debate in 1858.
So it's within this very unique context that the CB&Q comes through this area of the state. And before we begin to explore that, just set the stage for us, if you would. How do you describe or define what the Underground Railroad even is, and what years did it operate?
Sure. The Underground Railroad is a general term that describes the means by which fugitive slaves escaped slavery, both into free states, into what were called maroon communities, where fugitive slaves, freedom seekers, could hide out and not even leave slave states, and of course, the story of fugitive slaves even boarding boats in order to get out of the United States entirely. It's true that most people, understandably, think of the Underground Railroad as a story of fugitive slaves escaping bondage and heading northwards towards Canada, where we live. But in fact, the Underground Railroad operated out of southern slave states in every direction, into Mexico, as far west as California, into the Caribbean Sea, and in some cases, fugitive slaves went to Europe with their owners and escaped slavery when they got abroad.
So in this part of the country then, about what years would we have expected to find operations of the Underground Railroad?
Sure. Galesburg comes in to its existence in the 1830s. But the state of Illinois joins the Union in 1818. The term Underground Railroad doesn't really begin to be used very much until the 1830s. And so at about the time, roughly, that Knox College and Galesburg are being established, that terminology is starting to be used. Railroads, of course, were, at least in my view, one of the most significant inventions that has an impact on Americans in the 19th century. I'd be hard-pressed to come up with an invention that had a broader impact than railroads. So, initially, railroad development in Illinois is stymied for many, many reasons. But in the 1850s in Illinois, it really explodes. And by the end of that decade, there's about 2,800 miles of track put down across the state. The first railroads in Illinois that are important to recall, we start with the old Illinois Central Railroad that goes from southern Illinois down by the Ohio River to connect to Chicago and the Great Lakes. And then later there's a railroad out of Chicago to Galena because of the importance of what were then the Galena lead mines. But eventually, of course, people begin to think of moving the railroads west. And in this case, they come out of Chicago, southwest, gradually get to Galesburg, and then the old CB&Q splits, one line directly west of Burlington and one down to Quincy. As that is all being constructed in the 1850s, we find then that what gradually happens is that fugitive slaves are actually escaping on real railroad trains. So all this terminology that was used by the Underground Railroad, passengers, cargo, station masters, conductors, all of the terminology of real railroads starts to be incorporated into the language of the Underground Railroad. The documentation on this turns out to be pretty easy to discover. S.J. Clark, in his History of McDonough County in 1898, actually says specifically that railroads were used by fugitives and it was a well-designed outlet for them to escape towards Lake Michigan and Canada. And we have various other accounts where people specifically refer to putting freedom seekers onto real trains during that period of time.
So the CB&Q builds south and west,
yes,
down through the state, through what it sounds like is an already fairly well-established path for freedom seekers headed north.
That's right.
What were the reasons or the factors that made that, let's call it Mississippi River to Chicago or Quincy to Chicago path desirous for the slaves that were leaving?
You've got to think of the way that fugitive slaves escape in many ways as haphazard. And their movement zigzags and there are U-turns and it takes all sorts of different twists. So you shouldn't think of it when you use the word routes as direct lines. But generally there were 4 routes that passed through Illinois. One from the southern tip up to the Illinois River, one out of the slave state of Missouri, St. Louis area, right along the Illinois River route. Another one that comes through Iowa, and it comes into the state. They move directly towards Chicago, or some of them follow the course of the Rock River into Wisconsin. But the 4th line we call the Quincy line, which is more or less the same line that the CB&Q then establishes later. There was a major Underground Railroad location in Quincy, another one in Galesburg, farther north in Princeton, and then on into Chicago. So even before the CB&Q is established, what they called the Quincy line beforehand was an area that a number of fugitive slaves were passing through. But please understand, there were a number of smaller farms and villages and hamlets where fugitive slaves were hidden as well. So the history of the Underground Railroad involves some of these earlier, larger towns along with these rural areas.
So the geopolitical factors are important. We've got this major waterway. We've got a slave state on one side. We've got a free state on another.
Yes.
And as you mentioned then, in comes the railroad. In the 1850s, construction of the CB&Q is moving to Mendota. In 1853, it arrived here in Galesburg, December of 54. That was the same year that the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed.
Yes.
Remind us what that act did and the reaction that it caused in free states like Illinois.
The story of American politics is dominated from the time the nation is established until the Civil War is over around the slavery issue. It comes to a high point and there's controversy, and then it dips down again, though it never goes away, and then it reoccurs again, and this happens periodically through the first 70, 75 years of American history. In 1854, it's one of these controversial high points. Stephen Douglas, who many people thought in the 1840s and into the 50s someday was likely to be the Democratic candidate for president and would likely win the presidency someday, Douglas was a person who wanted to keep Southerners happy and Northerners happy. So he proposed and really ushered through Congress the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which in effect canceled what the earlier Compromise of 1820, or Missouri Compromise, had established several years earlier. So in 1820, Congress says everything north of the parallel 3630, you can't have slavery. Everything south of that, slavery can exist. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act canceled all of that. Now, Douglas said, with the passage of this act, people can move into these western territories, and the people who move out there can decide whether or not they want slavery or not. He called that popular sovereignty. Don't let the people in Michigan determine what people in Nebraska are going to do about slavery. Don't let people in North Carolina determine what people that move to Kansas will do. We'll leave that up to them. It backfired on him. In fact, shortly after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, he commented once something like, "You could see the lights from Washington, D.C. to Illinois of me being hung in effigy," okay, and burned in effigy. So what happens is that Douglas realizes that this is maybe going to cause him some problems politically back in Illinois. And it's at this very same time that the reaction nationally on the part of Northerners against this act sees the early organization of the Republican Party that's finally well enough established in 1856 that they nominate John C. Fremont for the presidency, and Abraham Lincoln's name and reputation around this controversy also begins to emerge.
It sounds like what we really have here is just a fascinating convergence of events. You have heightened foment, if you will, among people who are certainly opposed to slavery, or maybe even some of those people who are willing to look the other way now are agitated by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And just at that time, we have the CB&Q constructing its way down by January of 56 all the way to the Mississippi River.
And one of the things during this period is that Douglas wants the major railroad that will extend all the way to California, not to go from Atlanta to Memphis to Southern California. He wants it to come out of Chicago through the middle of the country to California. And in order to do that, you had to have people settle in Kansas and Nebraska. And so as a result of this, it's very, very important for Douglas to be able, hoping someday maybe to be president, that when he introduces this idea into Congress for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he's going to, again, keep both Southerners and Northerners happy. And what happens really, I think, is that after he finds himself put into this box of controversy around this, he realizes that people in the central and northern part of Illinois aren't going to be very happy with him. On the other hand, he knows that in southern Illinois, counties that were substantially settled decades earlier by people who mostly settled southern Illinois, coming from southern pro-slavery states, that he was going to have to negotiate what he said about it in terms that would make both groups happy. Frankly, by the time he gets to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he finds that very difficult to do.
So what does this mean for a fugitive slave? You now have a railroad that's been constructed from Chicago, this CB&Q's now all the way down to the Mississippi River. How did that change traffic on the Underground Railroad?
Well, immediately, of course, I suppose, it became obvious to both people who were pro-slavery and anti-slavery that fugitive slaves would no longer have to move by foot or perhaps get in a wagon and be hidden by an Underground Railroad operator, or even utilize bodies of water. They sometimes could, of course, move by boat, which was faster. But now, by getting on a railroad, you could get away much faster than before. So what happens is we begin to find these accounts of people telling us directly stories about how they did this. Emma Chapin was the daughter of a very famous nationally known abolitionist by the name of William T. Allen, who spent the last part of his life up in Geneseo, Illinois. Chapin put down in a letter in the 1890s that she remembered actually times when trains would stop for water stops for their steam engines, and slaves at night, while those stops occurred, actually putting fugitive slaves on real trains. Galesburg, given its rather remarkable abolitionist reputation, we find stories of people who worked on the CB&Q. A man by the name of Solomon Kimball leaves an account. A man by the name of William Patch, who was an employee of the old CB&Q, left stories of putting fugitives on trains in Galesburg. There's even one account that's a little difficult to verify, but which is an interesting story I came upon during the course of my research, where a train that pulled into Galesburg slowed down, and if there was a light left in a window and a house right by the tracks, the train would slow to a snail's pace in order to quickly get fugitives onto freight cars. But there are even accounts, on occasion, of fugitives being put onto passenger cars, and the conductors of the railroad letting that happen without calling attention to it in order to get them to Chicago. In Chicago, there was a physician, Dr. C.V. Dyer, who was one of the most notorious Underground Railroad operators in the state. He had ties to early railroad development in Illinois, all the way back to the first railroads that were built out of Chicago, the old Aurora Branch Railroad. In any case, Dyer's name comes up frequently. In fact, up in Bureau County, an Underground Railroad operator by the name of John Bryant left us an account where he put several slaves on a train close to Princeton, where he lived, and he specifically refers to putting them on that train in order to get them to Dr. Dyer in Chicago. So obviously, when railroads start being constructed through this part of the state, it was clear that we can put freedom seekers on these trains and they can get away much more quickly, and therefore it's not as likely they're going to be captured.
Less dangerous travel, much easier travel, and a lot quicker passage then to Chicago.
Absolutely. And though, of course, there was still the need to provide food and shelter at various points before you could put them on railroad trains, which was one of the most important things that Underground Railroad operators did for these fugitives, who often, when they fled, literally only had the clothes on their back and very little food with them. It was important then for all of those things to take place, but in addition, of course, then take this final step of getting them away as fast as they could.
And these operators, this was high-stakes business. They were taking a real personal risk to help these slaves, correct?
Absolutely. The very same year that the cotton gin is invented, in 1793, and of course, in many ways, cotton was what drove slavery in the South more than any other agricultural product. That year, 1793, is when the first federal government laws passed, the Fugitive Slave Law, prohibiting fugitives being aided to escape. And then in 1850, as part of the Great Compromise of 1850, which was kind of the last great compromise Congress tried to come up with before the Civil War starts 10 years later. In 1850, a much stronger fugitive slave law is passed by Congress that actually required people to help a sheriff or a law officer stop what they were doing and be deputized to help fugitives escape. These people who were involved with the Underground Railroad are American heroes, in my view, because they were willing to take the risk to do what was against the law, but which many of them felt, based upon both religious beliefs and moral grounds, the need to take what many of them called following the course of the higher law of helping these people gain their freedom.
We've talked about some of the unique circumstances that made the CB&Q so important in this Underground Railroad movement.
Yes.
And you've just touched on another one that I wish you would elaborate on. The community of Galesburg had a unique beginning and had deep abolitionist roots. Tell us that story.
Well, in the 1830s, the anti-slavery movement begins to cohere and really come together and become organized in a way that it never had been before. I mean, you can go well back before the United States is even established, back to the colonial period and earlier. And there are accounts of people trying to do things to help slaves escape slavery and even organize themselves as abolitionists. But the abolitionist movement really becomes strongly structured with the establishment in 1833 of what was called the American Anti-Slavery Society. Its offices were in New York City. It was established in Philadelphia in December of 33. George Washington Gale, who comes out with this colony of people to establish this college and town, had been one of the leading figures of that organization when it was initially established in the 1830s. He's so well connected to these people that even after he comes out to Illinois to start this community, he continues to travel east for the annual meetings of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So Galesburg obviously was a community, unlike almost all of them in the Middle West at that time, that had the overwhelming majority of the people who lived in the town committed to these principles of anti-slavery advocacy. And to a great extent this was influenced because when Gale was in New York before he came out here, he was also a figure associated with what was called the Second Great Awakening, a great and powerful evangelical religious movement that rejected the tenets of old Calvinism and said that everybody should have the opportunity to gain the Lord's salvation if they'll embrace Christianity and demonstrate by the good works of their life that they were truly Christians. And when they said everybody, they meant everybody, including slaves. At that time, that was a rather radical position to take. So here are these people that come from upstate New York out to this very wide open region of western Illinois and establish that kind of community. And brother, they were considered troublemakers.
Well, presumably some of these same troublemakers became locomotive engineers, conductors, and other employees on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy line.
Right. And this connection to the railroad, as I suggested earlier with some of the accounts I gave you, is also verified in the first really important book published about the Underground Railroad in 1898 by Ohio State University historian Wilbur Siebert. When he gets to covering this story in Illinois, he, even in that book that early, is talking about the fact that the CB&Q Railroad was used by fugitive slaves.
And when these slaves reached Chicago, as you mentioned, they were often welcomed by a gentleman named Dr. Charles V. Dyer.
Yes.
They knew that there would be someone on the other end to meet them and to guide them from there.
That's right. That's right. By the time you get to the outskirts of Chicago, there are a number of Underground Railroad locations that kind of ring the city. But once you get into the heart of the old city itself, Dyer was one of the leading abolitionists, along with a number of other people. Flavel Bascom was a famous operator there, and a number of others. But in addition, in the African American community, John and Mary Jones were African Americans who, along with other African Americans, some of whom who had escaped slavery, were also deeply involved with this movement. And so here's another example of both African Americans and Euro-Americans working together to help these fugitives escape. Many of them decided to take the risk of staying in Chicago, which was risky because you might be captured and returned to slavery. Many times, however, these people in Chicago were willing to help these fugitive slaves either get on boats to go across Lake Michigan and into the state of Michigan and into Canada, or loop down the bottom of Chicago around Lake Michigan, the north part of Indiana, into Michigan, and again farther northward into Canada. Michigan in the Middle West becomes a kind of funnel where slaves are escaping and seeking their freedom all the way from Iowa and Illinois to the west, to Indiana, Ohio, and even western Pennsylvania into Michigan.
Oh, and I'm really intrigued by some of the anecdotes or the stories in your book about parties of escaping slaves, of freedom seekers, who travel in broad daylight.
Yes.
Some of them even unaccompanied on the CB&Q.
Yes.
It sounds remarkable for what we know about the illegality of the act and that there were people out looking for them, that their passage would be so bold.
It becomes bolder by the time you get close to 1860. But please understand two things. Even though there were occasions, and we have records of fugitive slaves being helped by Underground Railroad conductors openly in the daylight, the Reverend Samuel G. Wright up in Stark County in his diary leaves records of actually commenting about occasions when he did it in the daylight. And there are times when we come across these accounts, again, more when you get into the 1850s. But for the most part, the Underground Railroad activity that takes place both on railroads and by other means, by wagon and on foot, on horseback, that's for the most part, you're finding times when slaves didn't want to be seen by day. And in fact, the rule usually was, try to hide during the day and travel at night. Fugitive slaves, like most people in those days, before the eras of television and cell phones and all the things we have to entertain ourselves today, people in those days were entertained by looking at the heavens at night. And of course, you could find Polaris, the famous North Star, that when you looked at it in this location was always a guide northward. But it's certainly the case that by the time you get closer and closer to the time that Lincoln's elected president, there are some of these cases where it was actually true that fugitives were traveling in daylight. And yes, we have accounts of large parties. I referred to the Bryant incident, where he sent fugitives on the CB&Q to Dyer in Chicago. That was a party on one occasion that was referred to as many as 15 slaves. There's another account down in Brimfield, Illinois, that didn't involve railroads, of 13 fugitives passing through Brimfield, Illinois. One was an elderly woman carried by two men who had her stretched out on a sheet between the two poles. She was being carried because she was so elderly. So there were actual cases of not only fugitives escaping alone or in twos and threes, but not on a lot of occasions, but on some occasions in rather large parties.
Well, we know that this route, the railroad route, was particularly well-traveled, and I want to ask you, if you're willing to maybe step out on a limb, what you might estimate how many slaves may have found their path to freedom on the steel rail. Is that even possible to
Some
guesstimate?
historians have decided to speculate about that. And numbers run from 50,000, 75, maybe 100,000 over the entire length of this period. But I've always been rather reluctant to answer that question. My brother-in-law is a theoretical statistician and mathematician at the University of Minnesota. And when I was first studying this subject, I asked him for ways to help me determine those numbers. And he said the records are so intentionally secretive that the probability of coming up with maybe a pretty accurate number would be pretty hard to calculate.
I appreciate your hesitation to do that and to guess, and that's quite understandable. What you have been able to do for us, though, is really tell an amazing story of a unique set of circumstances about how a railroad interacted with fleeing slaves to help many of them find their freedom.
Well, I've appreciated the opportunity to do so, and I very much appreciate your coming here to the campus and visiting me in what we call the Lincoln Studies Center, where we hope that both the college's connections to Abraham Lincoln and the college's early advocacy of being on the right side of history is one that we're still delighted to tell.
Thank you for sharing your scholarship and your expertise with us.
Thank you.